Hello, I'm Sebastian Michael, and this is this Saturday's sonnet. Oh, how I faint when I of you do write, knowing a better spirit doth use your name, and in the praise thereof spends all his might to make me tongue-tied speaking of your fame. But since your worth wide as the ocean is, the humble as the proudest sail doth bear, my saucy bark, inferior far to his, on your broad main doth wilfully appear. Your shallowest help will hold me up afloat, whilst he upon your soundless deep doth ride. Or, being wrecked, I am a worthless boat, he of tall building and of goodly pride. Then, if he thrive, and I be cast away, the worst was this, my love was my decay. And this is sonnet number 80, and it is certainly, and for a host of astonishing reasons, a mess of fascinating extraordinariness, one of the most interesting sonnets that we've come across so far. And that makes it the ideal candidate for our sonnet in Saturday's Sonnet episode 13, the first episode that sits in the second half. We are now in the second half of our sonnets. We're still in the fair youth segment, we're still addressing our sonnets to a fair youth, and we are also in another subset, you could call it, of the sonnet, which sometimes gets referred to as the rival poet sonnets. Sonnets that feature one, possibly several, certainly one rival poet. Of course, one of the questions that we will want to ask is, who is the rival poet? I'm not going to be able to answer it. The sonnets simply don't tell us, but they do tell us for certain that on the scene has appeared a new person and a new factor, a new disturbance as far as I, Shakespeare, am concerned. Very clearly not something I am happy with, not something that I am thrilled about in the least. Because now I'm beginning to expend a fair bit of my verbal dexterity and my poetic passion on a whole different brand of jealousy, on jealousy of the artist, an artist's jealousy of another artist, another writer. But as you can imagine, here, as in so many other instances, it isn't quite as simple and straightforward as all that. There may well be another additional emotional layer, or several, and that's what makes this sonnet and this week's sonnets so particularly interesting and so very unusual as well. It starts off with sonnet 78, where I claim quite boldly that the way I write sonnets about you is different, because you are all my art. You are the substance of what I write about, and I, because I truly love you, I have been doing nothing other than in one way or another sing your praises. Not strictly true this, but that's what I claim. And I also quite boldly assert that when others write about you, thou dost but mend the style. They essentially remain superficial. It's just that you influence the style in which they write, but it's of a different quality altogether. Others. I mention others in a general way, not just one other person, but others generally. And then in number 79, I narrow this down and I start referring to one other poet specifically, not naming him, about whom I say that when he talks about you, all he's doing is give you back what he took from you. When he gives you your beauty in his poems, all he's really doing is give you back something he's taken from you. He's been inspired by your beauty, therefore he's just giving it back to you. Therefore, don't reward him for the things that he's giving you, because it's just giving you what you already own anyway. Arguably, that's what I've been doing too, but I really claim that the substance and the quality and that the integrity of my poetry is fundamentally different, is of a different character and kind to this other person who's writing about you. Then comes number 80, which I'm going to talk about in more detail, but I'm going to skip this right now for the moment, just to give you the whole overview. We get to 81, where I for a moment forget about the other poet and go back to familiar territory, which I've done several times before, where I say my verses will be a memorial to you. This is not new, it's just interesting that this still comes up, it comes up again, and of course, in a way, you could say, well, in the context of the rival poets, it's a gesture of assertion, again, of saying, look, I am the one who can make you live forever. By 82, I'm back on the subject of other poets, and I say to you, well, of course, you are completely entitled. You're not married to my verse. You have every right, being who you are, to cast your eyes over other people's poetry and their dedications and their fawning over you. Just remember that I am your true friend, and I am the person who writes truthfully to, for, and about you. And then by 83, I almost anticipate a little bit something of a King Learian lament, a Cordelian lament, wouldn't it? Where I say, look, I never thought it was necessary to embellish your beauty, to paint your beauty. And you may remember, out of interest, that I've previously been disparaging about painted faces, and I will be so again, I can assure you. I, William Shakespeare, hold not much store with painted faces, with the fashions of the painted face. I don't like it. I like a natural look. And I compare poetry now to this embellishment, to this artifice of painting a beauty that's already beautiful. And I say, look, I always thought that you didn't need that. You're beautiful enough as you are. And this is actually true. If you look at the sonnets, hardly ever do I resort to poetic cliches. So it depends on, well, what you call a poetic cliche and what you assume to have been a poetic cliche then and what is one now. If I were to write, Sebastian Michael, were to write to the person I'm currently in love with, you are as beautiful as a summer's day, then nobody would take that seriously as poetry. That would just be a very cheap imitation of Shakespeare. It would be a poetic cliche. You can't today invoke a summer's day as a metaphor for a beautiful, gracious, mild-mannered person, because it's been done. But in Shakespeare's day, of course, it hadn't been done yet until he wrote it. And so by comparison to, say, poetic cliche of his day, it is actually true to say that Shakespeare does not really describe the young man. I eschew that entirely. I seem to think that, look, you know how beautiful you are, everyone knows how beautiful you are, I do not need to describe you. And here I almost lament, I complain about the fact that I've never felt this was necessary, and I still don't think so now. And I conclude with the couplet that goes, there lives more life in one of your fair eyes than both your poets can in praise devise. And now we know we're talking about both poets, two poets, this other poet and me. And that would suggest that previously when I was talking about other poets in general, that was maybe just me being a little bit facetious or a bit sarcastic. This is not an unusual thing to do. If you've ever been in a relationship or have observed relationships, I have observed relationships much more than I've been in them, but you observe this, you see couples do this, don't you? You see partner say to their other half, as it were, well, if some people would occasionally throw out the rubbish, then our flat wouldn't end up stinking like tuna fish by the end of the day. And it's a ridiculous statement to make, because there's only one other person they live with. They are a couple, they live together, they don't have children, nor do they have dogs, nor do they have goldfish. So the other people that are being referred to generally in a mildly sarcastic way, it's just the other person. To distance ourselves from this other person whom we are having an issue with at the moment, we refer to them as the generality. Oh, by all means. but you can think of endless examples, can't you? Why don't you invite your friends round on Sunday night? When you've said, do you mind if I bring Toby along, who happens to be in town? By all means, bring some friends, it'd be lovely. I wanted to spend my time, I just want to spend the evening with you alone. Bring some friends, why not bring the others as well? I only spoke about one person who happens to be in town. If you've been in a relationship, you've seen that, been there, done it. And of course, our poet Shakespeare is in a relationship. What he has with the young man is a relationship. It's just interesting that the young man has allowed somebody else into this relationship, another poet. And then in 84, which is the last one of this week's sonnet, I continue this theme about truth, about me being the person who tells the truth in poetry, who is truthful, and who is the genuine article, the genuine friend, the genuine lover, not some other person who has come along and now also writes some lovely words about you. And I go one step further here. And again, this hints, we don't need to hint at it anymore, we know this now. But again, the language that now comes in the last couplet of Sonnet 84 is something you say to somebody who you know very well, who you have a degree of involvement with that allows you to admonish them for their flaws, for their character flaws. And I say to the young man, you to your beauteous blessings add a curse, being fond on praise, which makes your praises worse. This is saying so many things at the same time. It's saying the other person is making your praises worse because all they do is use poetic language to embellish your natural beauty that doesn't need embellishing. They are not genuine, they're not truthful. And you'd be better off not being quite so vain and not needing all this praise and listening instead to your real friend, to your proper friend, to the man who loves you, me. So I will come to the question, what does the sonnet mean, and translate it. But what I'd like to pursue for a moment longer is the phenomenon, if you like, of this group of sonnets, and where it stems from. It stems from there being another poet. We can't answer the question who the other poet is, although it's an interesting question. There is much speculation about that, which you can read on. At least as interesting, if not perhaps even more so, is why is there another poet? Now, perhaps another poet just simply decided, I like this young, rich, influential, powerful man too, why shouldn't I write sonnets to him? But that's not sufficient to explain my sonnets here in response to them, because if it was just some random poet writing some random poetry to this young man, and the young man didn't respond to this in any way, or did not adopt this other poet as a patron, say, or let him into his existence, then I, Shakespeare, would have no reason to be so upset about it. But I'm clearly extraordinarily upset because I go on and on and on about it. Bracket here, interesting to note, when my mistress came into the equation and young, beautiful lover just decided while I was away to have a thing with her, I was upset and I called it a disgrace. But I got over it pretty quickly. Within about 2 or 3 sonnets, I got over it and I forgave and said, this is the way it is, you are forgiven, that's what happens when women woo. Here, with this artistic jealousy from another man, who may or may not also be a competitor for my lover's affections on a different level, maybe even on a sexual level. We don't know for certain, but as you will see, there are some hints being dropped. That really winds me up. It winds me up for a good dozen or more sonnets that I go on about this. So I'm upset. And so clearly the young man has let somebody else into his life. He has clearly given a preference, advantage, maybe just attention, certainly allowed somebody else to be noticeably engaged in writing poetry for him. Why? You may remember that in episode 11, I ventured the thought that maybe our young man was growing up emotionally somewhat, because I was able to say, you see me for who I am, you see me for where I am in my life, towards the end of my year, the end of my day, the end of my fire, and you love me all the more for it. And that would signal, I suggested, a degree of emotional maturity, a growing up, and a degree of faithfulness and reliability, dependability in the young man. No sooner have I said this, and what happens? The young man goes and finds another person again. Last time, when I laid claim on the young man, he went off with my mistress. This time, when I tell him that you see me for who and what I am, and you love me all the more, what does young man do? He goes off with another poet. Metaphorically speaking, poetically speaking, artistically speaking, maybe financially speaking, maybe he supports him, maybe even physically speaking. It is entirely possible. It is certainly not to be ruled out, and it's not certain either. So maybe we've overestimated our young man. Maybe we've given him more credit than we could just yet. But then remember, he's very young, and although he's a little bit older, a year or maybe more older than when we first met him, he's still doing a lot of growing up into a proper adult. On the other hand, there may also be other factors, because remember, we also talked about voices of slander being heard, of disquiet, of my poetry being called worthless, of me saying to the young man, distance yourself from me so as not to be tarnished with my reputation, of me telling the young man, your reputation is tarnished, of not being clear whether I mean through his own doing or purely through what other people want to achieve. Certainly there is disquiet, certainly there are rumors, and there is a reputation at risk. And so it could, of course, also be that the young man simply broadens his base and says, well, if you tell me I need to distance myself from you because otherwise my reputation is in danger, then why don't I actually do that by almost like as a decoy, either as a decoy or for real, adopting some one or two, maybe just one other poet. So nobody can say, well, we're in a special relationship, so that I have also other poets whom I support. Whatever the reasons, whatever happens, whatever the young man actually says to me, whichever way I look at it, it's painful. It's painful not to be the exalted and only one anymore. I felt I was the special one in your life. So maybe you had other lovers, maybe you had went off with women here and there, maybe with other men here and there, but I thought I was the one who writes poetry for you and who expresses his love for you in words, and whom you respect and love for his art, at least as much, if not in fact much more, than for whatever else I may be. And I have made it fairly clear what else I am. I've made it fairly clear that I cannot live up to other, or maybe even your standards of beauty and grace, and let alone riches. But I can write timeless poetry. And I've said it so many times now, I've even said that I've said it so many times, that I can only think of you, I can only write about you, but that is something I can do, and the words that I write, they have the power to live forever. It's a bold assertion to make, and sometimes I get knocked down, but I do actually get up again. And it's painful. Now I'm a little bit down. Now I'm very down, actually. Now I feel there's somebody else on the scene, and not somebody I seem to rate in particular. And so even though I call him things like a better spirit, I don't think I really believe that. I don't think I really believe he's a better writer. And I don't think I really believe he's a better human being. And I probably know who he is. It's a relatively small circle of people in London at the time who write poems and who hang out together with these rich courtiers and noblemen. It's not a big city, London at the time. It has a few tens of thousands of inhabitants. So we don't know why the young man has let the rival poet into the equation. Stating it is because of this or of the other would be conjecture. The words don't tell us why you've done that, they only tell us you've done that and you shouldn't have. And I'm not going to go away. In this particular one, and you will see what happens next week, but in this particular sonnet, number 80, I'm not just going to disappear. So, what does it mean? Sonnet number 80. Listen to this, it's fascinating. Oh, how I faint when I of you do write, knowing a better spirit doth use your name. Oh, how I faint. It's very melodramatic, how I faint. Maybe he means it as melodramatic, maybe he wants to be a little bit over the top, maybe he wants to go, oh, how I faint. Maybe he wants to actually just say, oh, how I am weakened, how I am undone by that thought. With some of these nuances, it's impossible for us to know for certain where the meaning lies. Knowing a better spirit doth use your name. A better spirit, you will find if you go and read about these sonnets that there's a lot of discussion about the use of the word spirit, because on the one hand, of course, a spirit is a ghost, a supernatural force or a supernatural entity or an ethereal entity. It's also, of course, the way we use spirit, the genius, the inspiration, and here personified. So the spirit, the other spirit is the other poet, there's no doubt about that. But it's interesting he uses the word spirit here, because it could be read a little bit either way. It could be a bit of a backhanded compliment. It could mean that, yeah, there's another poet, but you have to treat him with some caution. There's something not entirely proper about him. And in the praise thereof, and in praising thereof being your name, spends all his might, does everything he can, to make me tongue-tied, speaking of your fame. Fascinating that I reflect this on me. So this other person's activity of writing is not just between you and him. It could be, couldn't it? It could be just another person writing for you, to you. Why would that affect me? But clearly, this other person is doing something to affect me, to make me tongue-tied, speaking of your fame. And we don't know, because of the way it's written, we can't be sure, is the speaking of your fame the other person, the other poet, and him speaking of your fame is what makes me tongue-tied. This could be the case if this other person goes on and on and on about how famous you are and how wonderful you are. That could make me self-conscious. All of a sudden I could suddenly realize, oh, of course I'm dealing with this real prominent person. Because that's an easy thing to forget if you get to know somebody really well and you feel you have an intimacy with them, that you forget, other people have a claim on them. So it could be that, or it could mean to make me tongue-tied speaking of your fame, to make me tongue-tied when I try to speak of your fame. But now we are into a second thought. So we have this other person, but since your worth, wide as the ocean is, the humble as the proudest sail doth bear. And we are into this metaphor of the sea from now on in, until the last couplet. So your worth bears both the proudest and the humblest sail. It is because it is as wide as the ocean. So the wide as the ocean is a description of your worth, but since your worth, wide as the ocean is, the humble as the proudest sail doth bear. And here the sail stands in for the poets, possibly for other things as well. And here it becomes interesting and ever so slightly entertaining, because we are in this sea metaphor and we use a lot of boats and sails and what have you. But some of these words begin to sound a little bit, and then a little bit more, and then more and more, also as though they may have other meanings. We have to be careful when we read other meanings into the words of any poet. No different with William Shakespeare. We know he's fond of puns. We know he does this a lot of the time when he wants to get a little bit saucy, and or even a lot, when he wants to talk about sex, sexual organs, sexual intercourse, sexual activity. He does it in a poetic way. He does it by punning on things. And here we are very rapidly moving towards vocabulary that suggests this is what he's doing. And so humble and proud sail are still purely nautical metaphors. For how much longer? Not so sure about that. My Saucy, because now it comes almost, if you do cryptic, I don't do cryptic crosswords, but I understand from people who do cryptic crosswords that now and then the composer of the crossword puts in a word that gets you as the person solving the crossword thinking, gives you a pointer as to which way you should think about it, what kind of technique is being employed. And here, our poet does something very similar, possibly, we don't know, but possibly, it could be the case. Because he's saying, my saucy bark, inferior far to his, on your broad main doth wilfully appear. A saucy bark could here just be the slightly disrespectful, impudent, maybe frivolous bark, appears willfully, little pun there on my own name, obviously, but also suggesting a degree of stubbornness or intransigence. I'm going to be willful about this, I'm going to be stubborn about this. On your broad main. So your broad main, the broad main is the surface of your broad sea, the main is the sea. Shakespeare uses this word every now and then. And on this broad main, my saucy bark will willfully appear. A bark is, again, a bark is of course a little boat, but it's also the angry bark of a dog, potentially. I promised you multiple meanings, multiple layers. Maybe we're reading too much into this. I don't have a feeling with Shakespeare we often are reading too much into this. The way he uses words, he really uses them pointedly and deliberately, and he has clearly a love for puns and wordplay and for multiple meanings. And so I don't think we are going too far off track if we find out what at least the possible meanings are. Which one then applies or which one we want to accept is another matter, but we certainly can identify quite a number of different meanings here. Your shallowest help will hold me up afloat. Even the shallowest help, the help here is a part of the sea, so even in your shallow waters, because I'm a saucy bark, I just bounce on your water. I need no more than that. A bit of your attention and your time, a bit of you is all I need to be upright, to be afloat. Whilst he upon your soundless deep doth ride. And I will leave it to you how you really want to interpret this, but I cannot get away from the innuendo. To me, this all sounds like innuendo. The soundless deep is the unfathomable deep. And why? And the explanation comes, and it comes again with a heavily loaded term, a heavily loaded sexual term, or being wrecked. I am a worthless boat, so I'm now wrecked, I'm shipwrecked, I'm effectively destroyed, so that makes me now worthless. He of tall building and of goodly pride. Choice of words, Willers, choice of words. The words I'm choosing here, they make me alert to the possibility that Shakespeare, the writer, is hinting, dropping a few hints here and there into this ocean, to this water, that maybe this other poet has more business, more affairs with you than purely the writing of his poetry. And then after all this, bear in mind it may all be innocent. It may just be one plain sailing nautical metaphor, and maybe we're reading far too much into it. Maybe he just couldn't think of a different word, of a different rhyme than ride and pride. But be that as it may, then quite a sobering thought, and quite a personal, quite a genuinely sad thought, really. Then if he thrive and I be cast away, the worst was this: my love was my decay. The truth of the matter, if he thrives and I am the castaway, I am the one whose boat sinks and I am cast away on an island somewhere I'm forgotten about, then what has undone me, the worst thing about this story, the worst thing about this outcome, is that it's actually just my love for you that has undone me, that has wrecked me. It's my love. It's not my selfishness or my pride or my arrogance or my possessiveness or my jealousy. It's really just my love. And again, this is such a poignant and pointedly human realization that sometimes, and you can experience this painfully from both sides or both ends of the equation, when you realize that somebody really loves you and they really, really do, but it's too much. They have to have too much of you, and you have to push them away, and it's painful when you do that. And of course it's painful when you are the person who is being pushed away because you are too deeply involved. And I am involved. There is so no doubt about this. I continue this theme for another whole batch of sonnets. I am deeply disturbed and out of joint now that there is on the scene not just another lover, although perhaps even that too, but another artist, another poet, a rival for the thing that means most to me and for the person who means most to me. It's the thing that means most to me as a poet and as a dramatist, as a writer. Are my words, are they not? I'm just saying this is conjecture. Shakespeare nowhere in his writing has said this other than when he says, my words will make you live forever. And you are the person I most deeply care about, without a shadow of a doubt. You do not write sonnet after sonnet after sonnet after sonnet to somebody who you don't care about. And so let's see how this unfolds, and let's see how this pans out when we continue with the theme of the rival poet. So remember, love is the power, and see you next week.